convenient world outlook gives rise to a conventional juridical term, social prophylaxis. It was introduced and accepted, and it was immediately understood by all. Lazar Kogan, one of the bosses of the White Sea Canal construction, would in fact soon say, quote, "I believe that you personally were not guilty of anything, but as an educated person, you have to understand that social prophylaxis was being widely applied," unquote. And when else, in fact, should unreliable fellow travelers, all that shaky intellectual rot, be arrested, if not on the eve of the war for world revolution? When the big war actually began, it would be too late. And so, in Moscow, they began a systematic search block by block. Someone had to be arrested everywhere. The slogan was, quote, "We are going to bang our fist on the table so hard that the world will shake in terror," unquote. It was to the Lubyanka, to the Bitirki, that the Black Marias, the passenger cars, the enclosed trucks, the open hansom cabs kept moving even by day. There was a jam at the gates, a jam in the courtyard. They didn't have time to unload and register those they'd arrested. And the same situation existed in all other cities. In Rostov-on-the-Don, during those days, the floor was so crowded in the cellar of House 33 that the newly arrived Boyko could hardly find a place to sit down. A typical example from this wave, several dozen young people got together for some kind of musical evening which had not been authorized ahead of time by the GPU. They listened to music and then drank tea. They got the money for the tea by voluntarily contributing their own kopecks. It was quite clear, of course, that this music was a cover for counter-revolutionary sentiments, and that the money was being collected not for tea, but to assist the dying world bourgeoisie. And they were all arrested and given from 3 to 10 years. Anna Skripnikova getting 5, while Ivan Nikolaevich Vorontsov and the other organizers of the affair who refused to confess were shot. And in that same year, somewhere in Paris, a group of Russian emigre lycée graduates gathered to celebrate the traditional Pushkin holiday. A record of this was published in the papers, and it was clearly an intrigue on the part of the mortally wounded imperialism. And as a result, all lycée graduates still left in the USSR were arrested, as were the so-called law students, graduates of another such privileged special school of pre-revolutionary Russia. Only the size of Slan, the Solovetsky Special Purpose Camp, limited for the time being the scale of the Voykov draft, but the Gulag Archipelago had already begun its malignant life and would shortly metastasize throughout the whole body of the nation. A new taste had been acquired, and a new appetite began to grow. The time had long since arrived to crush the technical intelligentsia, when it had come to regard itself as too irreplaceable, and had not yet gotten used to catching instructions on the wing. In other words, we never did trust the engineers, and from the very first years of the revolution, we saw to it that those lackeys and servants of the former capitalist bosses were kept in line by healthy suspicion and surveillance by the workers. However, during the Reconstruction period, we did permit them to work in our industries, while the whole force of the class assault was directed against the rest of the intelligentsia. But the more our own economic leadership matured, the VSNKH, the Supreme Council of the Economy, Plan, the State Planning Commission. The more the number of plans increased and the more those plans overlapped and conflicted with one another, the clearer became the old engineers' basic commitment to wrecking. Their insincerity, slyness, venality. The sentinel of the revolution narrowed its eyes with a greater vigilance, and wherever it directed its narrow gaze, it immediately discovered a nest of wreckers. This therapy continued full speed from 1927 on, and immediately exposed to the proletariat all the causes of our economic failures and shortages. There was wrecking in the People's Commissariat of Railroads. That was why it was hard to get aboard a train, why there were interruptions in supplies. There was wrecking in the Moscow electric power system and interruptions in power. There was wrecking in the oil industry, hence the shortage of kerosene. There was wrecking in textiles, hence nothing for a working man to wear. In the coal industry, there was colossal wrecking, hence no heat. In the metallurgy, defense machinery, shipbuilding, chemical, mining, gold and platinum industries, in shipbuilding, in irrigation, everywhere there were these pus-filled boils of wrecking. Enemies with slide rules were on all sides. The GPU puffed and panted in its efforts to grab off and drag off the wreckers. In the capitals and in the provinces, GPU collegiums and proletarian courts kept hard at work, sifting through the viscous sewage, and every day the workers gasped to learn, and sometimes they didn't learn, from the papers of new vile deeds. They learned about Papshinsky, Von Meck, Velichko, and how many others who were nameless. Every industry, every factory, and every handicraft artel had to find wreckers in its ranks, and no sooner had they begun to look that they found them. With the help of the GPU, if any pre-revolutionary engineer was not yet exposed as a traitor, then he could certainly be suspected of being one. And what accomplished villains these old engineers were. What diabolical ways to sabotage they found. Nikolai Karlovich von Meck of the People's Commissariat of Railroads pretended to be terribly devoted to the development of the new economy, and would hold forth for hours on end about the economic problems involved in the construction of socialism, and he loved to give advice. One such pernicious piece of advice was to increase the size of freight trains and not to worry about the heavier than average loads. The GPU exposed von Meck, and he was shot. His objective had been to wear out the railroads and roadbeds, freight cars and locomotives, so as to leave the Republic without railroads in case of foreign military intervention. When, not long afterward, the new People's Commissar of Railroads, Comrade Pagonovich, ordered that average loads should be increased and even doubled and tripled then, and for this discovery he received the Order of Lenin along with others of our leaders. The malicious engineers who were protested became known as the limiters. They raised the outcry that this was way too much and would result in the breakdown of the rolling stock. And they were rightly shot for their lack of faith in the possibilities of social transport. These limiters were pursued for several years. In all branches of the economy, they brandished their formulas and calculations and refused to understand that bridges and lathes could respond to the enthusiasm of the personnel. These were the years when all the norms of folk psychology were turned inside out. The circumspect folk wisdom expressed in such a proverb as haste makes waste was ridiculed, and the ancient saying that the slower you go, the farther you'll get was turned inside out. The only thing which at times delayed the arrest of the old engineers was the absence of a new batch to take their place. Nikolai Ivanovich Ladizhensky, chief engineer of the defense plants in was first arrested for limitation theories and, quote, blind faith in safety factors, which explained why he considered inadequate the funds allocated by the Ordzhonikidze for factory expansion. Then they put him under house arrest and ordered him to pack his work in his old job. Ordered him back to work in his old job. Without him, the work was collapsing. He put it back in shape, but the funds allocated were just as inadequate as they had been earlier, and so once again he was thrown in prison, this time for, quote, incorrect use of funds. The funds were insufficient, they charged, because the chief engineer had used them inefficiently. Ladizhensky died in camp after a year of timbering. Thus, in the course of a few years, they broke the back of the old Russian engineers who had constituted the glory of the country, who were the beloved heroes of such writers as Garin, Mikhailovsky, Chekhov, and Zamyatin. It is to be understood, of course, that in this wave, as in all of them, other people were taken too. For example, those who had been near and dear to and connected with those doomed. I hesitate to sully the shining bronze countenance of the sentinel of the revolution, yet I must. They also arrested persons who refused to become informers. We would ask the reader to keep in mind at all times, but especially in connection with the first post-revolutionary decade, this entirely secret wave, which was never surfaced in public, and at the time, people still had their pride, and many of them quite failed to comprehend that morality is a relative thing, having only a narrow class meaning, and they dared to reject the employment offered them, and they were all punished without mercy. In fact, at this time, young Magdalena Zhubova was supposed to act as an informer on a group of engineers. And she not only dared to refuse, but also told her guardian it was against him she was supposed to inform. However, she was arrested soon anyway. And in the course of the investigation, he confessed everything. Magdalena, who was pregnant, was arrested for revealing an operational secret and was sentenced to be shot, but subsequently managed to get off with a 25-year string of sentences in that same year, in 1927, though in a completely different milieu among the leaders of among the leading Kharkov communists, Nadezhda Vitalyevna Surovets refused to become an informer and spy on the members of the Ukrainian government. For this, she was arrested by the GPU, and not until a quarter of a century later did she manage to emerge, barely alive, in the Kolyma. As for those who didn't survive, of them we know nothing. Kolyma was the gold mine in the far, far east, and it was one of the roughest places to go, as far east as you can get. The other side of the country from Moscow. And they didn't fly there. In the 30s, this wave of the disobedient fell off to zero. If they asked you to, then it meant you had to inform. Where would you hide? The weakest go to the wall. If I don't do someone else will. Better me than someone bad. Meanwhile, there were plenty of volunteers. You couldn't get away from them. It was both profitable and praiseworthy. In 1928, in Moscow, the big Ch.2 case came to trial. Big in terms of publicity it was given in the startling confessions and self-flagellation of the defendants, though not yet all of them. 2 years later, in September 1930, the famine organizers were tried with a great hue and cry. They were the ones. There they are. There were 48 workers in the food industry, and at the end of 1930, the trial of the Palm Party was put on with even greater fanfare. It had been faultlessly rehearsed. In this case, every single defendant took upon himself the blame for every kind of filthy rubbish. And then, like a moment unveiled, there arose before the eyes of the workers the grandiose, cunningly contrived scheme in which all the separate working classes previously exposed were tied into one diabolical knot, along with Milyukov, Rubishinsky, Deterding, and Poincaré. As we begin to understand our judicial practices, we realize now that the public trials were only the surface indications of the mole's tunnel, and that all the main digging lay beneath the surface. At these trials, only a small number of those who were arrested were produced at court. Only those who agreed to the unnatural practice of accusing themselves and others in the hopes of getting off more easily. The majority of engineers who had the courage and intelligence to reject and refute the interrogator's stupidities were tried out of earshot, but even though they did not confess, they got the same tenors, 10 years, from the collegium of the GPU. The waves flowed underground through pipes. They provided sewage disposal for the life flowering on the surface. It was precisely at this moment that an important step was taken toward universal participation in sewage disposal, universal distribution of responsibility for it. Those who had not yet been swept bodily down the sewer hatches, who had not yet been carried through the pipes to the archipelago, had to march up above carrying banners praising the trials and rejoicing at the judicial reprisals. And this was very far-sighted. Decades would pass and history would have its eyes open, but the interrogators, judges, and prosecutors would turn out to be no more guilty than you or I, fellow citizens. The reason we possess our worthy gray heads is that in our time we worthily voted for. Stalin carried out the first such effort in connection with the trial. With the trial of the famine organizers. And how could it not succeed when everyone was starving in bounteous Russia, and everyone was always looking about and asking, where did all our dear bread get to? Therefore, before the court verdict, the workers and the employees wrathfully voted for the death penalty for the scoundrels on trial. And by the time of the Prom Party trial, there were hundreds. And by the time of the Prom Party trial, there were universal meetings and demonstrations, including even school children. It was a newspaper march of millions, and the roar rose outside the windows of the courtroom. Death, death, death. At this turning point in our history, there were some lonely voices of protest or abstention, and very, very great bravery was required to say no in the midst of that roaring chorus of approval. It is incomparably easier today. Yet even today, people don't very often vote against. To the extent that we know about them in those same spineless, slushy intellectuals. At the meeting of the Leningrad Polytechnic Institute, Professor Dmitry Apollinarovich capital punishment in general. You see, in the language of science, you see, this was an irreversible process. And he was arrested then and there. The student Dima Olitsky abstained and was arrested there and there, then and there. That's all these protests were silenced at the very source. So far as we know, the great mustached working class approved of these executions. So far as we know, from the blazing komsomols right up to the party leaders and the legendary army commanders, the entire vanguard waxed unanimous in approving these executions. Famous revolutionaries, theoreticians, and prophets 7 years before their own inglorious destruction welcomed the roar of the crowd, not guessing that their own time stood on the threshold, that soon their own names would be dragged down that roar of scum filth, be dragged down in that roar of scum filth. In fact, for the engineers, the route soon came to an end. At the beginning of 1931, Yosef Vissarionovich spake his 6 conditions for construction, and his autocracy vouchsafed as the 5th condition. We must move from a policy of destruction of the old technical intelligentsia to a policy of concern for it, of making use of it. Concern for it. What happened in the meantime to our just wrath? Where had all our terrible accusations gone to? At this very moment, as it happened, a trial of the wreckers in the porcelain industry was underway. They had been playing their filthy tricks even there. All the defendants had damned each other in unison and confessed to everything, and suddenly they cried out in unison again, "We are innocent." And they were freed. There was even a small reverse wave to be marked in this particular year. Some engineers who had already been sentenced or put under interrogation were released. Thus, D.A. Rozhansky came back. Should we not say he had won his duel with Stalin? And that if people had been heroic in exercising their civil responsibilities, there would have never been any reason to write either this chapter or the whole book. That same year, Stalin was still engaged in grinding beneath his hoof the long since prostrate Mensheviks. There was a public trial in March 1931 of the All-Union Bureau of Mensheviks, Roman Sukhanov and Yakubovich, and a certain number of small scattered unannounced arrests took place in addition, and suddenly Stalin reconsidered. The White Sea folk say of the tide, the water reconsiders, meaning that the moment just before it begins to fall. Well, of course, it is inappropriate to compare the murky soul of Stalin with the water of the White Sea, and perhaps he didn't reconsider anything whatever, nor was there any ebb tide. But one more miracle happened that year. In 1931, following the trial of the Prom Party, a grandiose trial of the Working Peasants' Party was being prepared on the grounds that they existed, never in actual fact, as an enormous organized underground force among the rural intelligentsia, including leaders of consumer and agricultural cooperatives and the more advanced upper layer of the peasantry. And supposedly were preparing to overthrow the dictatorship of the proletariat. At the trial of the Prom Party, this Working Peasants' Party, the TKP, was referred to as if it were already well known and under detention. The interrogation apparatus of the GPU worked flawlessly. Thousands of defendants had already fully confessed their adherence to the TKP and participation in its criminal plans, and no less than 200,000 members altogether were promised by the GPU, mentioned as Heading the party were the agricultural economist Alexander Vasilyevich Shayanov, the future Prime Minister Kondratyev, um, Yurovsky, Makarov, Doyarenko, a professor from the Timiryazev Academy, future Minister of Agriculture. Then, all of a sudden, one lovely night, Stalin reconsidered. Why? Maybe we will never know. Did he perhaps wish to save his soul? Too soon for that, it would seem. Did his sense of humor come to the fore? Was it all so deadly, monotonous, so bitter tasting? But no one would ever dare accuse Stalin of having a sense of humor. Likeliest of all, Stalin simply figured out that the whole countryside, not just 200,000 people, would soon die of famine anyways, so why go to the trouble? And instantly the whole TKP trial was called off, and those who had confessed were told they could repudiate their confessions. One can picture their happiness. And instead of the whole big catch, only the small group of Kondratyev and Shayanov was hauled in and tried. In 1941, the charge against the tortured Vavilov was that the TKP had existed and that he had been its head. Paragraph piles on paragraph, year on year, and yet there is no way we can describe the sequence of everything that took place. But the GPU did its job effectively. The GPU never let anything get by, but we must always remember that. 1. Religious believers, of course, were being arrested uninterruptedly. There were nonetheless certain special dates and peak periods. There was a, quote, night of struggle against religion, unquote, in Leningrad on Christmas Eve 1929, when they arrested a large part of the religious intelligentsia and held them, not just until morning either, and it was certainly no Christmas tale. And in February 1932, again in Leningrad, many churches were closed simultaneously, while at the same time large-scale arrests were made among the clergy. And there is still more dates and places, but they haven't been reported to us by anyone. Second point. Non-Orthodox sects were also under attack, and even those sympathetic to communism. Thus, in 1929, they arrested every last member of the communes between Sochi and Kosta. These communes ran everything, both production and distribution, on a communist basis, and it was all done fairly and honestly, in a way the rest of the country won't achieve in 100 years. But alas, they were too literate, they were well read in religious literature, and atheism was not their philosophy, which combined Baptist and Tolstoyan beliefs with those of yoga. It appeared that such a commune was criminal and that it could not bring people happiness. In the 20s, a large group of Tolstoyans was exiled to the foothills of the Altai, and there they established communal settlements jointly with the Baptists. When the construction of the Kuznets industrial complex began, they supplied it with food products. Then arrests began. First, the teachers. They were not teaching in accordance with the government programs, and then the children ran after the cars shouting, and after that, the commune leaders were taken. Next point. The big solitaire game with the socialists went on and on uninterruptedly, of course. Next point. In 1929, also those historians who had not been sent abroad in time were arrested. Platonov, Tarl, Lubavsky, Gotya, Likachev, Ismailov, and the outstanding literary scholar M.M. Bakhtin. Next. From one end of the country to the other, Nationalities kept pouring in. The Yakuts were imprisoned after the revolt of 1928. The Buryat Mongols were imprisoned after the uprising of 1929. And they say about 35,000 were shot, a figure it has been impossible to verify. The Kazakhs were imprisoned after the Budanis cavalry heroically crushed their revolt in 1930 and 1931. The Union for Liberation of the Ukraine was put on trial at the beginning of 1930. Professor Yefremov, Tchaikovsky, Nivosky, etc., and knowing the ratio in our country of what is public to what is secret, how many others followed in their footsteps? How many were secretly arrested? Then came the time. Then came the time slowly. It is true, but surely, when it was the turn of the members of the ruling party to do time in prison, at first from 1927 to 1929, it was a question of the workers' opposition, in other words, the Trotskyites who had been chosen themselves such an unsuccessful leader. They numbered hundreds at the start, soon there would be thousands, but it's the first step that's the hardest. Just as the Trotskyites had observed with approval the arrest of members of other parties, so the rest of the party now watched approvingly as the Trotskyites were arrested. But everyone would have its turn. The non-existent rightist opposition would come later, and limb by limb, beginning with its own tail, the ravenous maw would devour itself right up to its own head. From 1928 on, it was time to call to a reckoning those late stragglers after the bourgeoisie, the NEP men. The usual practice was to impose on them ever-increasing and finally totally intolerable taxes. At a certain point they could no longer pay. They were immediately arrested for bankruptcy and their property was confiscated. Small tradesmen such as barbers, tailors, even those who prepared premise stoves were only deprived of their licenses to ply their trade. There was an economic purpose to the development of the NEP men wave. The state needed property and gold, and there was as yet no Kolima. The famous gold fever began at the end of 1929. Only the fever gripped not only those looking for gold, but those from whom it was being shaken loose. The particular feature of this gold wave was that the GPU was not actually accusing these rabbits of anything. It was perfectly willing not to send them off to Gulag country, but wished only to take away their gold by main force. So the prisons were packed, the interrogators were worn to a frazzle, but the transit prisons, prisoner transports, and camps received only relatively minor reinforcements. Who was arrested in the gold wave? All those who, at one time or another, 15 years before, had had a private business, had been involved in retail trade, had earned wages at a craft, and could have, according to GPU deductions, hoarded gold. But it so happened that they often had no gold. They had put their money into real estate or securities which had melted away or been taken away by the revolution, and nothing remained. They had high hopes, of course, in arresting dental technicians, jewelers, and watch repairmen. Through denunciations, one could learn about gold in the most unexpected places. A veteran lathe worker had somewhere gotten a hold of and held on to 60 gold 5-ruble pieces from Tsar's times. The famous Siberian partisan Muryav had come to Odessa, bringing with him a small bag full of gold. The Petersburg Tatar draymen all had gold hidden away. Whether or not these things were so could be discovered only inside prison walls. Nothing, neither proletarian origin nor revolutionary services, served as a defense against a gold denunciation. All were arrested and all were crammed into GPU cells in numbers no one had considered possible up to then. But that was all to the good. They would cough it up all the sooner. It even reached a point of such confusion that men and women were imprisoned in the same cells and used a latrine bucket in each other's presence. Who cared about those niceties? Give up your gold, vipers. The interrogators did not write up charge sheets because no one needed their papers, and whether or not a sentence could be pasted on was of very little interest. Only one thing was important. Give up your gold, viper. The state needs gold and you don't. The interrogators had neither voice nor strength left to threaten or torture. They had one universal method: feed the prisoners nothing but salty food and give them no water. Whoever coughed up gold got water, 1 gold piece for a cup of fresh water. People perish for cold metal. This wave was distinguished from those that preceded it and followed it because, even though fewer than half the victims held their fate in their own hands, some did. If you, in fact, had no gold, then your situation was hopeless. You would be beaten, burned, tortured, and steamed to the point of death until they finally came to believe you. But if you had gold, you could determine the extent of your torture, the limits of your endurance, and your own fate. Psychologically, this situation was, incidentally, not easier but more difficult, because if you made an error, you would always be ridden by a guilty conscience. Of course, anyone who had already mastered these rules of the institution would yield and give up his gold. That was easier, but it was a mistake to give it up too readily. That they would refuse to believe you had you coughed it all up, and they would continue to hold you. You'd be wrong to wait too long before yielding. You'd end up kicking the bucket, or they'd paste a term on you out of meanness. One of the Tatar draymen endured all the tortures. He had no gold. They imprisoned his wife too and tortured her. But the Tatar stuck to his story. No gold. Then they arrested his daughter. The Tatar couldn't take it anymore. He coughed up 100,000 rubles. At this point they had let his family go, but slapped a prison term on him. The crudest detective stories and operas about the brigands were played out in real life on a vast national stage. The introduction of the passport system on the threshold of the 30s also provided the camps with a good-sized draft of reinforcements, just as Peter I simplified the social structure, sweeping clean all the nooks and crannies of the old Russian class system. So our socialist passport system swept out, in particular, the betwixt and the between insects. It hit at the clever, homeless portion of the population, and it wasn't tied down to anything. In the early stages, people made many mistakes with those passports, and though not registered at their places of residence, and those not registered of having left their former places of residence, were raked into the archipelago, if only for a single year. And so the waves foamed and rolled, but all over them, in 1929 and 30, billowed and gushed the multi-million wave of dispossessed kulaks. It was immeasurably large, and it could certainly not have been housed in even highly developed network of Soviet interrogation prisons, which in any case were packed full of the gold wave. Instead, it bypassed the prisons, going directly to the transport prisons and camps onto prisoner transports into the Gulag country. In sheer size, this non-recurring tidal wave, it was an ocean, swelled beyond the bounds of anything the penal system of even an immense state can permit itself. There was nothing to be compared with it in all of Russian history. It was the forced resettlement of a whole people, an ethnic catastrophe, but yet so cleverly were the channels of the GPU, Gulag organization, and the cities would have noticed nothing had they not been stricken by strange 3-year famine, a famine that came about without drought and without war. We'll take a break.